Real-time strategy games used to be huge. They're one of the biggest video game genres, sold millions, and dominated the esports scene. Every year, new titles would come out, all offering their own unique little twists to the classic RTS gameplay. I loved real-time strategy games. The first game I ever played was a real-time strategy. My earliest gaming memories was playing through the campaign to the first Command & Conquer. Despite being young at the time and not really knowing what I was doing, the top-down view of the battlefield and the feeling of control I got meant I was hooked. As I got older, I got better at playing real-time strategy, and I started to get a feel for the mechanics. I have fond memories of playing team games with my friends against each other at LAN parties, as well as fighting against opponents online. At this point, RTS was still riding high, and is one of the most popular video game genres. Then, times changed. Classic series started to die, the player base began to dwindle, and eventually, MOBAs rose to take the RTS's place at the esports table. While there are still some RTS games that command impressive player bases, such as StarCraft 2 and Age of Empires 2 HD, the genre is nothing like it was. This has led many gamers to declare RTS a dead genre. Seeing as RTS was such an important part of my gaming history, this saddens me greatly. I long for a modern RTS to come along and bring the genre back to mainstream popularity. There are still some developers who are trying to revive the genre of life support. There have been different approaches, all trying to modernize the classic gameplay. This is to varied success, and some of the attempts have alienated the very player bases they rely on to keep RTS alive. The indie video game studio Pocket Watch Games decided to throw their hat into the ring and try their hands at making a real-time strategy game. The studio having previously made the award-winning heist game Monaco. The RTS game they ended up making was Tooth and Tail. While me and many others have been disappointed with many of the RTS games coming out recently, Tooth and Tail has blown me away. I can honestly say I haven't had this much fun playing an RTS game in years. It is stealing my free time. I sit down to play a couple of games and then just keep on playing, telling myself I'll play just one more round. Hours pass. The last RTS to grip me so strongly was the original Dawn of War. That game came out over 10 years ago in 2004. So why has this game had such a large impact, while other titles, some of which had massively higher budgets, failed to grab my interest? I'm going to be giving on my opinions on why I felt RTS failed, my MOBA rose to take its place, where recent attempts to reboot RTS have failed, and why Tooth and Tail succeeds. This is going to be a long video. While I'm sure some of you will sit through the whole thing, for anyone who doesn't have time or is interested in watching it in blocks, you can find the timestamps of the different topics in the description. Watching high-level RTS players face off against each other is incredible. The skill ceiling for RTS games is extremely high, which is what made them the perfect game for esports. To be able to complete at the highest level, players have to be able to put in an insane amount of commands in a short time frame. Not only that, but all of these commands need to be accurate. Games last an average of 30 minutes, and it isn't unusual for a single misplay during this time period to cost the game. Put simply, playing RTS well is difficult. It's a strain. This is also what makes the genre so incredibly satisfying. If you play well, you can completely decimate your opponent. Games where you're facing off against someone of equal skill level, there's a level of intensity and focus required. When you finally make that game-winning play after 30 minutes of intense concentration, the rush you get is incredible. However, this is also what can lead many people to stop playing. The pressure on you to perform is huge. This has led to what is known as ladder anxiety. It's a condition where people are afraid to jump into the game and play. Knowing how they play can affect their global ranking as a player. They are paralysed by anxiety. It's a problem so intense that professional players have had to share their tips and tricks to avoid being damaged by it, ranging from having a cup of tea, playing a different game for a while to cool off, and even meditating. While RTS games are great fun to play, the experience of feeling physically drained after playing a match is not unusual. While there are some gamers who love this intense competition and pressure, having a game where you literally have to stop playing and go play something else to cool off isn't that great a sign. This is one of the things that interests me about the rise of MOBAs. We have seen RTS games lose popularity, and MOBA games rise to take their place. RTS and MOBA games have many similarities: the isometric view, the competition against other players on a square map. However, whilst in RTS games you have to control your resource production, build your base, and manage your armies all on your own, in MOBAs you control one hero unit, and you have 4 teammates to support you and to help you recover from any bad plays that you might make. I'm not saying that MOBAs take less skill to play at the very highest levels, but I am saying that having the support of teammates and only controlling a single character has meant that I cannot think of a time I've been so physically drained after playing a MOBA that I stopped to play something else. In fact, I often just keep playing, laughing with my teammates about any bad plays I might have made, rather than stewing alone over my mistakes. Compare this with RTS games, where all the pressure is on yourself. This led people to regard StarCraft 2 as an incredibly antisocial game, and has led some people to say that the community itself is an antisocial one. Bringing in teammates has an incredible psychological effect, of not only making your failures easier to deal with, but making the experience of playing a much more social one, reducing the pressure on you as a player. The bottom line is that I would say, with MOBAs, the pressure on you as a player is much less compared to RTS games. This has made MOBA games huge not only in esports, but also among the numerous casual players who fire up the game to enjoy a few matches with their mates. If I was to focus on one issue that caused MOBA to take the RTS crown, this would be it. I even remember playing Warcraft 3 back in the day and wanting a mode where I would only command my hero unit, not knowing at the time that games resembling this would eventually become one of the biggest video game genres ever. While I thought that this focus on micro and high-level play was what was dooming the RTS genre, I'm not sure games companies thought the same way. Most of the big-budget RTS games to come out recently have featured some dramatic changes to the classic RTS formula, but have still maintained this focus on micro and high-level play. Rather than reducing the pressure that's on you as a player, the changes were often an attempt to make the games more modern, feeling that what was dooming the RTS genre was the old-school mechanics that just aren't as popular anymore. One high-profile example of this is Dawn of War 3, which attempted to incorporate MOBA elements, trying to appeal to modern gamers. It did this by bringing in hero units and making the basic line units weaker. So weak, in fact, that many players thought they ended up being nothing but meat shields for your more powerful hero units, giving the game a very MOBA feel for an RTS. However, this ended up completely alienating the classic RTS gamers, while also failing to attract a new audience. Also, drawing the ire of the Dawn of War community, that still keep the original Dawn of War alive through an impressively large modding scene. Dawn of War 3 was a complete flop, and all support has now ended less than a year after release. An incredible achievement for such a high-budget title belonging to a classic and well-loved franchise. I feel that Tooth and Tail has taken a very different route. The game is unashamedly an old-school RTS that has all the classic game mechanics. When playing Tooth and Tail, I was amazed by how well these classic mechanics still work, and how many different ways to play they offer you. You can still turtle, you can still rush, you can still sneak expand. All the classic plays that you can find in much larger games, such as StarCraft 2, are here, and it still works amazingly well. The classic RTS gameplay was never what was holding the genre back, and it could still be both addictive and amazingly fun to play. The fact that so many of the reviews I have read about Tooth and Tail reference StarCraft, the game that epitomizes the classic RTS design philosophy, really drives this home. That isn't to say that Tooth and Tail hasn't made any changes, it has made major ones. But rather than changing the core RTS gameplay, the areas where Tooth and Tail have moved things around is how with you, the player, input commands into the game. In Tooth and Tail, you are the cursor, and you move around the map with the W, A, S and D keys. When I first heard and read about this, I thought there would be no way it could work. Not only did I feel that it wouldn't work, but also felt it would be deeply frustrating, thinking about how annoying I would find this while playing StarCraft, Age of Empires, or Dawn of War. Because of this, I only ended up buying Tooth and Tail when it was on sale, and I'm a huge RTS fan. However, after playing the game, I am blown away by how well it works. There's still a decent amount of micro involved. Differences between player skill levels still have dramatic effects on how the match turns out, but the feel of the game is different. By sticking the cursor onto a character, it has put the macro of both players onto a similar playing field. You no longer have to constantly pop the camera back to your base to recruit more units, or move around resource gatherers. You still need to go back to your base occasionally to build more unit-producing buildings, but this can be done from anywhere on the map through a button that allows you to borrow, then pop up at any building you own. This one change, making the player character the cursor, made while keeping the classic RTS game mechanics in place, has made the game a blast to play. It was a genius way of reducing the pressure put onto the player who is playing the game, while at the same time still allowing for a high skill ceiling. I find myself focusing more on the strategy part of the game, planning when to make my plays and my positioning and army composition, and less on maintaining my EPM and going through the usual repetitive tasks that are required in most RTS games to get to the good bits. Now you have to factor in your character's movement into your strategies, which is something you don't have to think about in other RTS games, as well as trying to keep your player character alive, something which reduces the amount of scouting you are able to do. But this wasn't the only major change that helps to reduce the pressure you are put under as a player. Matches in Tooth and Tail are also much shorter. While matches in StarCraft 2 usually last from around 20 to 30 minutes, matches in Tooth and Tail only last around 5 to 10. This has a significant impact on the amount of ladder anxiety I experienced while I was playing. With matches being that much shorter, there was much less thought being put into jumping into another game. The fact that the matches are so quick and fun also meant I ended up spending hours and hours just jumping into one match after another. This is achieved primarily by making the map smaller. While I'm sure that there are many of you watching who upon hearing this feel like turning away from the game, but I feel the map sizes achieve a great balance. They are small enough to keep the games action-packed and short, but large enough there is still a great deal of thought and strategy, able to pull off great flanks and side attacks, and still giving a purpose to high-speed units. However, it's not only on the player pressure front that MOBAs have beaten RTS games. MOBAs have a ton of different heroes to choose from, making the number of possible team combinations go into the billions. This provides a great deal of variety to your games. While some heroes are more favoured during the current metas, there's enough variety to make each game feel unique. My experience of playing Dota pays testament to this. Dota is currently my most played game on Steam, which is amazing since it isn't my favourite game by a long shot. What made me keep coming back, however, was the incredible amount of variety. I would often stick to one hero for a long amount of time, then swap to another for a change of pace. Also, the large variety of opponents also made each game interesting, as you'd learn about how the enemy hero choices work together. Compare this to RTS games, which often have around 3 races and are played on fixed maps. Most of the time, the build orders being almost exactly the same each time you play. The amount of variety is much less. Tooth and Tail has taken an interesting approach here. The first is that it uses random maps. This provides a great deal of variety to the matches that you play. While it has annoyed some players, it works amazingly well towards making each map feel different. It also helps that the game has plenty of ways to play to allow you to adapt to an unlucky role. This is a testament to how well the different playstyles are balanced. If you find yourself in a bad spot, you can still fast expand to cover more of the map, or rush your opponent. I was very impressed with the map generator the game uses. In all the games I played, there wasn't a single time where I felt I was completely doomed by the map generation. All the games I played seemed reasonably balanced. There's also variety in the biomes. While this does not have an impact on the gameplay, it does help to make the maps feel even more varied and helps to keep the game fresh when you're engaging in hours-long gaming sessions. However, it is not only the fantastic random map generator that provides this game with its high amount of variety. It is also in the fact that it doesn't have races. Instead, you create your army in an interesting way. Instead of races, it has a pool of 20 units, and each match you can only pick 6. This helps to introduce some more variety, as different players will enjoy using different combinations of units. I'll have a more in-depth look at the different units later. This is a feature that brings in the largest amount of variety. Games where different players have chosen different army combinations produce a large variety of different experiences. Your army choice will have a big impact on your playstyle. Will you rush with a horde of cheap units, slowly creep across the map with defences and long-ranged artillery units, or quickly go for your most expensive and powerful units? Each producing a very different experience. Not only in playstyle, but also how the different units interact with each other. There's a variety of cheap units and expensive units to choose from, for example. You and your opponent's army choices will rarely be exactly the same. The short match times, with the customizable armies and the randomized maps, provides the game with a great deal of variety and makes it easy and enjoyable to just keep on playing. This variety, combined with the reduced pressure on you as a player, has made the game one of my favourite RTS games that have come out in years. Some players have called the game an RTS Lite, but I feel this does it a great disservice. While it has taken steps to reduce the pressure on you as a player, it still has all the classic RTS mechanics. It is a very traditional RTS game, in a time where designers keep messing with the formula. But because of this, it works amazingly well, because the traditional RTS mechanics are solid. They work, they're fun. The work the game has done to reduce the pressure on you as a player has produced a game I can't get enough of playing. It is a game I would highly recommend to anyone who is interested in playing a great real-time strategy game. That's a broad overview of why I think Tooth and Tail succeeds as an RTS, and why I think it's just what the RTS genre needs after spending such a long time in decline. I hope its focus on reducing player pressure and introducing variety is a model that RTS games will follow in the future. But for this, we'll now have to wait and see what happens. I will now be taking a more in-depth look at the game itself. Here is where I'll be putting a spoiler warning. I'll be talking through the campaign, taking an in-depth look at the different units and how well they all work with each other. If I haven't convinced you to pick up the game yet, then I would seriously consider it. While I would regard it as worth the purchase at full price, if I managed to find the game on a sale, then I would regard it as a steal. It is definitely an RTS worth trying, even if you only have a passing interest in the genre. Now that the spoiler warning is out the way, let's move forward. I guess a good place to start is talking about the game's art style. Now I am sure that there will be many of you who disagree with me, but I remember first looking at the screenshots of the game and thinking that it looked ugly. Pixel art has been something of a hit and miss for me. I do understand how it's great at providing graphics to indie titles in a way that is both cheap and easy to implement. However, I just couldn't see it working that well for an RTS game. One of the main focuses for RTS games is being able to clearly see what unit is what and where they are on the map. Because of this, I didn't think that pixel graphics would be a good fit. However, after playing the game, I have to admit that these worries were unfounded. Like my discovery after playing that my initial worries about the control scheme, my graphic worries didn't hold up after playing. This is one of those rare games that ends up being so much better than the initial impression I got from looking at the Steam page. In terms of the theme, it seems to be a sort of Russian Revolution Red Wall. This general theme works well with the game's story, and all the presentation is consistent. It was fascinating to engage with, especially how each of the game's 4 teams seems to be based around the different politics that was going on in Russia around the time of the Russian Revolution. I enjoyed playing through the campaign and learning about the different characters. I was impressed with the world design and found that the game had much more thought put into it than I initially expected. I got the impression that they designed the campaign missions first and then tried to build the story around this, the story taking a back seat to the gameplay. However, the world design and atmosphere was so strong that it managed to keep me engaged despite the story seeming like it was just there to connect one level to the next. The ending is also fantastic, but it's something I don't want to spoil so people can encounter it themselves. One of the things about the game I was most impressed with is how well the music works with the atmosphere of the game. It was composed by Austin Wintory, who also composed the fantastic soundtrack for Journey. The 2 soundtracks sound nothing alike, however. The soundtrack of Journey is sweeping and beautiful, which totally matches the stunningly beautiful game. The soundtrack of Tooth and Tail has a very different feel, which matches the tone and world created in the game. This is a huge testament to the ability of the composer. I don't think you'd have any idea the 2 games had the same composer unless someone told you. To say I am impressed with the soundtrack is an understatement. It has obviously been inspired by Russian music, but is written in such a way to match the feel of the world perfectly. It's the kind of music I can totally imagine a load of Slavic animals engaging in a violent revolution would be listening to, which is a sentence I never thought I would ever say. As well as having a general game soundtrack, each of the 4 factions also has a couple of their own tracks that manage to perfectly fit the feel of the different factions. The first faction is the Common Folk, who are the communist revolutionaries of the world of Tooth and Tail. Their soundtracks has the feeling of a folk song, although there are parts of it that sound a bit more militaristic, matching the very rag and tag feel of the faction's artwork. The second faction, the capitalist longcoats, have a different theme. It sounds a bit less like a folk song and a bit more of a classical vibe, which better represents the longcoats. Again, with the drums providing a militarist undertone. The longcoat art represents them as wearing fine clothing living in a large mansion, matching the classical vibe of the song. The third faction are the KSR. Their soundtrack was again very different than the previous 2, seeming to be based more around brass instruments, which would fit in well in a regiment's marching band, which matches the uniformed militarist nature of the KSR. The final faction, the Civilized, have church organs, which match the fact that they are a religious faction. They also have some great violin work. Of all the factions, the soundtrack of the Civilized are my favourite by far, which led me to play these guys the most in the multiplayer. There is just one part that always gets me. That's all well and good. Let's now get into talking about the gameplay. One big problem with RTS games is the initial hurdle of difficulty people have to go through in order to understand enough to start playing at even a basic level. RTS games can be very complicated for people who are not used to them. If someone only has experiences playing first-person or third-person games, the isometric view and the controls can be really jarring. I feel that Tooth and Tail is one of the easier RTS games to get into for someone who doesn't have much experience with the genre. The fact that you have a player character that you control makes it much easier to understand and get to grips with. The first few levels of the Tooth and Tail campaign work as a tutorial to teach you the different elements of the game, each focusing on a different game mechanic to provide players with a good understanding of all the different mechanics about halfway through the campaign. Because of this, I highly recommend anyone jumping into Tooth and Tail for the first time to start with the campaign mode. But even after going through the tutorial and the campaign, when starting multiplayer, some hints and tips to allow the player to adapt is always useful. Here is where the fact that you are a playable character really helps. Every so often, they'll say something that gives you hints on how you should play. If you are building up a lot of food without spending any, they'll mention that saving this much without spending it is a waste. Or if you haven't scouted in a while, they'll mention that they wonder what the enemy is up to. All of the sound files are in keeping with the character you are playing, and didn't become annoying. But it did really help me to get to grips with the flow of the multiplayer game when I first jumped in, and I feel it is a genius way of helping new players get to grips with the flow of the multiplayer. Each of the levels in the campaign also has hints you can follow. Not only do these hints help you with the campaign mission, they also teach good micro and strategy tips that can help with the multiplayer. I am very impressed with how much effort the game puts in towards helping new players get to grips with all the different systems. If you are to go through the campaign, following all the hints, and making sure to follow your character's voice hints while playing, I imagine even someone completely new to RTS games will be able to cope and play at a reasonable level, which is a seriously impressive feat for a game genre that is known for its high initial difficulty curve. Again, I feel this is something the RTS genre really needs to learn and understand if it's to win back any major mainstream appeal. They aren't easy games to play, and I feel the subtle things that Tooth and Tail does, especially with your player character dropping you hints every now and then, really help to settle new players into the experience. Many people regard RTS games to primarily be a player versus player genre. While I see their point, I do enjoy a well-made campaign to play alongside my ladder games. Tooth and Tails features a campaign mode that has 24 levels, all of which have additional objectives you can achieve if you want to be a completionist. I was also impressed with how different some of the levels felt compared to playing the multiplayer mode. While some of the levels just felt like a multiplayer match with an AI opponent, using units you didn't pick, others felt generally inspired, the little twist they threw into the game. This includes a variety of weather effects that can change how you approach the missions in a big way. The fact that these changes made the missions feel sufficiently different from the multiplayer mode also gave a reason to return to the levels and play them again even after finishing the campaign. I enjoyed the campaign enough that I plan to play it again to complete all the optional objectives, achieving a 100% completion rate. What I will say, however, so the difficulty's a bit all over the place. Some of the levels are easy, while others took me hours to beat, trying and failing I don't know how many times. On one, I even resorted to looking through the net to find guides to help me beat it. The campaign is split into 4 sections. During each section, you'll be commanding one of the 4 factions that is present in the campaign. The Communist Common Folk, the Capitalist Longcloaks, the Militarist KSR, and the Religious Civilized. Each has their own home base, an area that you can explore between missions. At this home base, you can walk around and communicate with some of the many animals that will be fighting for you. They often have amusing lines, or will tell you stuff that gives you a better understanding of the story and the world. As well as being a great way to immerse you more into the experience, these home zones are also brilliantly designed, driving home the differences between the game's factions, as well as being a joy to explore. I love this little addition, and I felt it was well worth the effort the makers must have put into it. The Longcloaks are based in a large mansion, full of artwork, a large bear, and also a brewery. The Common Folk in a rundown underground train station, full of animals sleeping on makeshift beds, and lines of animals lining up for some food. The KSR have a military bunker filled with intel rooms, prisons and courtyards, and the Civilized are in a large temple complex with a magnificent garden. You can jump between the different home bases and also replay missions you have previously completed, also talking to any of the NPCs that you might have missed the first time around. You start the campaign with the Longcloaks. They also introduce the first parts of the story, which lays the scene for why the different factions are fighting each other. Now for some spoilers. The basics of the story is that the animal world is primarily meat-eating. The only way they have managed to cope with an essentially cannibalistic civilization is through the church, led by the Civilized, having a lottery that decides who gets eaten and who doesn't. The Longcloaks leader's young son lost the lottery, which caused the Longcloaks to rebel and raise up arms against the church and the Civilized. Around this time, the Common Folk are having a communist revolution, and the KSR are trying to restore order. Each of the factions has 6 missions. The Longcoats missions are primarily tutorials that are based around learning the mechanics of the game, teaching you how to build units, the importance of grist mills, and how to set up a good defense. While the basic game mechanics are taught by the Longcoat campaign, it also introduces you to the story's characters and the world. After the Longcoats, the campaign then moves on to commanding the Common Folk. Here is where the campaign missions start to get much more interesting. Here additional rules that make the levels different from the multiplayer matches start to get introduced. The common one for the Common Folk missions is that water heals your troops. This affects how you play through the levels and improves your map awareness, starting to plan attacks and invasions from the lakes placed around the map. The level design also gets more interesting. The first has you running around with an army freeing prisoners. After this is a mission. You have an ally you have to defend, and enemy units continuously spawn until the enemy is defeated. Both of these being a very different experience from each other. The third level is when things get really interesting though. Here there is an additional few rules added on. The level is practically an almost normal skirmish level. The difference is now that your units take 1 damage per second whenever they're outside your territory, and also that any food that you have that is above 200 gets instantly spoiled. This makes you approach the level very differently. It's also a great way to try and teach players not to float their resources, and to get used to spending as much as they can. Floating resources being a common problem among players that are new to RTS games. Keeping up your spending and spending on the right stuff is an important skill that will help you greatly as you approach the game's multiplayer. Going over these Common Folk missions gives you an idea of just how varied they can be. It is impressive how many different experiences they've been able to fit into the game. Now we move on to playing as the KSR, the game's militarists. The first mission introduces you to the campfire. These work like a mini base, providing resources and expanding your territory, but in a smaller way than the larger bases. This level requires you to use them to win. having it that whenever your units are outside your territory, they slowly freeze to death. It's a cool way of introducing campfires, which are also found in the multiplayer, and it is a reasonably fun level. The second mission is primarily based around teaching you how to use the Wolf, one of the game's tier 3 units. It is one of their most unique units in the game, which is why it deserves an entire mission devoted to understanding it. It can speed up the production of units. This, combined with the fact that on this map all units are hired individually, means that using the Wolf to speed up the individual unit construction allows you to get a large army in a small time. The final missions are with the Civilized, and here is where I really felt that the campaign stepped up a huge amount. I won't bother to cover all the individual levels, plus you'll take away some of the joy from encountering them yourself. The levels I've talked about so far is only scratching the surface. But what I will say is that apart from a few difficulty spikes, the campaign was a joy to play through. The criticism the designers got about the difficulty curve seems to have been heard, and since I played through the campaign, there's been a patch that aims to rebalance it. RTS games live and die by their units. Even if you manage to get the art style, story, and campaign all correct, if the units in the game are not fun or interesting to use, then the whole thing just falls flat. Thankfully, Tooth and Tail has a large variety of different units. I can imagine the designers talking about all the different unit archetypes you can find in an RTS game, then trying to fit every single one of them into the game. There's almost everything here, from the equivalent to Banelings, the Protoss Carrier, to the good old Soviet conscript from Red Alert 2. Tooth and Tail has 15 different units, as well as having 5 different fortifications. Fortifications being amazing for locking down a position and being the favourites of any turtle player. The units are split into 3 tiers, with higher tier units being more powerful but also costing more to deploy into the battlefield. This works like a tech level, with the game's combat being split into 3 sections, with early game battles usually only consisting of tier 1 units, mid-game having tier 2 being introduced, and eventually late game fights featuring a wide mixture of different units. I will now go through all the different units that are in the game and have a little talk about them, how they perform and what you can expect out of them. Starting with tier 1, the first are the Squirrels. They fit the niche of being the basic foot soldiers of the game. Cheap, numerous, and able to put down a lot of hurt if they're in a big enough group. It's a unit you'll end up seeing in almost every game that you play. In my mind, they remind me of the Soviet conscripts from Red Alert 2, able to deal an impressive amount of damage when in a large number, but being particularly vulnerable to AoE attacks. Their design is also amusing, being alcoholics that drink fermented acorns for courage. Then there are the Lizards. I was initially confused by this unit, seeing as they seemed so similar to the Squirrels. I wasn't really sure what their niche was. However, after playing for a while, I started to understand. These guys cost the same as the Squirrels, although they have a shorter attack range. What they do have, however, is incredible speed. Playing well with the Lizards can have you quickly advancing to take out key enemy structures, and then retreating before the enemy army can react. They're also great for flanking the enemy forces while their front line is engaged. If you can use these guys well, there's an impressive number of different plays that you can do with them. Toads are Tooth and Tail's answer to the Banelings, and they are probably my personal favourite unit in the game. A large enough group of these guys commanded well can decimate enemy armies. They are cheap and numerous. It's important to keep these units protected from enemy fire as they are weak and die easily. However, explode them at the right time and the battle is yours. So extremely satisfying. They're often used in tier 1 with Squirrels. Most commonly, some players go with a mix of Squirrels and Lizards, while others go Squirrel and Toads. Others go Squirrel and Pigeons, which we shall look at next. The Pigeons are the first flying unit we shall look at. They have no attack, but instead provide healing. The fact they are flying means they cannot be targeted by melee units. As well as this, it also means they have an extra +2 sight range. This extra sight range is very useful when you are also using artillery ferrets or the sniper wolf, which we shall have a look at later. The last tier 1 unit are the Moles. These guys work differently to all the others we have looked at so far. The difference is that, unlike the others, these guys don't have a base building that constructs them. Instead, they can be built anywhere on the map. Because of this, they're great for supporting an attack and can provide that little bit of extra power that causes you to win a fight. They're also great for sneak attacks upon the enemy base from unprotected angles. From this combination of Tier 1 units, you can see how the early game can be quite varied depending on the choices you make. This variation grows significantly when you then introduce Tier 2 units. Unlike some other RTS games that I have played, moving on to Tier 2 can be done quite early, and rushing a Tier 2 unit can be a good strategy if you feel you haven't made enough space for yourself. Again showing how well balanced the game is, and how well it sticks to the classic RTS mechanics. Looking at Tier 2 units now, the first is the Ferret. These guys are the artillery unit of the game. They have a powerful long-range weapon. They are best for when you want the enemy to fight into you, being able to bombard the enemy without them being able to respond. Combined with the defensive buildings, they are a very strong unit. Not only are they great on defense, but they're also the Tier 2 anti-turtle unit. If you notice that your opponent has built lots of base defenses, you can use the ferrets to take out their defenses from afar, forcing them to respond and attack you head on. Now we have the Falcons. These are your primary air units. They are flying and can deal a seriously impressive amount of damage. However, they are also very fragile. Because of this, they are a unit that needs tougher units to soak up the damage so they can keep on dealing their high damage per second without being picked out of the sky. Skunks are next. These are your primary area of effect attack. They put down a poison cloud upon an area, dealing a small amount of damage over time to any units unlucky enough to be around. If your opponent has invested heavily in Tier 1, these guys are a great pick. The enemy numbers will be no match for the gas clouds you create around the battlefield. Now we have the Charmeleons, a strange unit in that they fit two different functions. The first is that they are a stealth unit. The enemy can only see them when they are attacking. Because of this, they are great for sneaky plays. The second function is being a tank unit. They have lots of health and so work fantastically at protecting your squishier units from attack. The last Tier 2 unit are the Snakes. These guys are the Tier 3 busters. Their unique thing is that they poison the units that they hit, dealing damage over time. Because of this, they are great against Tier 3 units, able to quickly poison them down to their deaths. However, they do not have much health. This means they struggle against large Tier 1 armies. As you can see, there's a large variety of different units fitting different roles. For most of the game, your army will be a mixture of Tier 1 and Tier 2 units. There are tons of different combinations to choose from, each of which will work differently in the game. I love this variety, and it's one of my favourite things about the game, allowing you to test lots of different play styles to then create a combination that works best for you, throwing this against whatever combinations your opponents have come up with. When the game reaches a stalemate, it's time to move on to Tier 3 units to break through and bring the game to an end. Here as well there's a huge amount of variety in how the different Tier 3 units work, and how they can interact with the different units you have chosen. The first Tier 3 unit to talk about is the Badger. The Badger is a unit that gets stronger the longer a fight goes on. It starts not dealing that much damage, but the longer it is engaged in combat, the more damage it does as its minigun charges up. It also doesn't have the biggest health pool. Because of this, it is very important to keep it protected and supported. Pigeons work well, to keep it healed up. If you can keep this thing alive, it'll win a fight. The next one to talk about is the Boar. This guy's a tank. Not only will it soak up an incredible amount of damage, but it's also armed with a flamethrower. This will allow it to deal out an impressive amount of AoE damage. This makes him a great choice if your opponent is fielding a large amount of Tier 1 units. The Boar isn't that great at taking out any tougher units you might face, however. Another thing the Boar has going for it is that when it dies it explodes, dealing a lot of damage and a large AoE, allowing it to still deal an incredible amount of damage as it dies. The next tier 3 unit is the Fox. This is the game's sniper unit. Not only does it move fast, moving about twice as fast as the other units, but has a long range and a high damage attack that makes it perfect for taking out enemy tier 3 units. However, it does not have that much health. This means that if it gets stuck fighting lots of weak enemy units, then it'll struggle and probably fall. The next unit is my personal favourite tier 3, that is the Owl. This is Tooth and Tail's equivalent to the Protoss carrier. It constantly spawns itself a small army of mice that can attack enemy positions. It's a great source for a constant amount of small units. It does take a bit of time for this army to reach maximum size. Because of this, it can be a struggle if your army gets defeated and you're left with only the Owls retreating. A bit of time being needed before it can enter the fight again at maximum power. The last tier 3 unit to talk about is the Wolf, which I mentioned earlier. This unit is very different from the others. The main difference is that the Wolf does no damage itself. Instead, it lets out a shout every now and then that buffs the effectiveness of your units, also allowing buildings to produce units quicker, making him not only effective in combat, but also for recovering and rebuilding your army after a fight. So those are the 3 tiers of units, but the game also features lots of fortifications that you can use to defend your base. This is for the players who want to play defensively and turtle up, or those who want to give themselves a bit of space to rebuild their army after a bad engagement. The first one to talk about is the machine gun nest. This is great for when the enemy is playing into you. They're relatively quick to build and can also be used quite effectively offensively if you get enough space for yourself to have the time to set them up. Next we have the barbed wire. This works rather differently to the other tools we have looked at so far. It damages and slows any enemy units that are moving through it. This can be great for funneling enemy forces towards where you want them to be, locking down choke points, while also giving you more time to react if the enemy decides to attack you from behind. The next one is the sniper balloon. This is like a stationary version of the Fox that we looked at earlier. This one is also flying, gives it a sight bonus, and also means it cannot be damaged by melee only units. It is great for picking off tough enemy units from afar. Next is the artillery cannon. This is the most powerful fortification you can construct, and it can completely lock down an area of the map. It is long range, deals AoE damage, is tough, and is a battle winner. The only real downside of this fortification is the fact that it cannot move. Because of this, the enemy can just play around it rather than engaging it directly. Even if they decide not to engage it, stopping any enemy units from entering a large area is still very useful strategically. The last fortification to take a look at is the landmine. These landmines are able to deal a large amount of AoE damage to a small area. They are great for scaring off an opponent who won't know where they are before they pop up. They can also be built anywhere, so you can set up some great defensive positions using them. So those are the units and fortifications. As I mentioned earlier, it's as though they try to fit in every RTS unit archetype they could think of. I personally think that Tooth and Tail is one of the best RTS games that have come out in years. It is well designed, has a great campaign and multiplayer, while also dealing with many of the issues that I felt has damaged RTS in the modern environment. The big question though, is what happens next to the RTS genre. Another big indie RTS game that came out recently is Northgard. This game, similar to Tooth and Tail, is based around reducing the amount of pressure that is upon you as a player, though it does it in a very different way. Northgard had introduced many elements of 4X games, and the best way I could think to describe it is a 4X RTS. It has all the main elements of explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate, also having multiple victory conditions that give you more ways to play rather than just going straight for your opponent. While they've both taken a route of reducing the pressure upon you as a player, and are both seeing some success from doing so, the games are wildly different in feel. While Tooth and Tail is a classic RTS that sticks to the classic RTS formula, Northgard is nowhere near this. Still, It's an interesting indication of where the RTS genre can go, considering it has thousands of players playing it, while Dawn of War 3, a game that had a much higher budget, has almost no one. The only real last standing AAA RTS series is the Total War games. Again, it isn't a traditional RTS. The pressure on the player being massively reduced by having 4x empire building and RTS battles being completely separate. Also primarily being a single player experience, although the multiplayer can be great fun. I mentioned Age of Empires 2 earlier on in this video, and I feel this is a very interesting indication of what is happening with the genre. The success of Age of Empires 2 HD on Steam has many interesting implications. The biggest of which is that Age of Empires 4 is now officially in production, being made by Relic, the same company which made the complete failure that was Dawn of War 3. Though this announcement does bring many questions, the biggest of which is what direction are they going? It's obvious that the most successful Age of Empires game by far was Age of Empires 2, which was based in the medieval time period. However, Age of Empires games have gone from the Age of Empires 1 being the classical period, through to the Age of Exploration, which was Age of Empires 3. With the making and release of definitive editions for the first 3 Age of Empires games, it seems likely that Age of Empires 4 will bring the game to a more modern era, perhaps World War I or II. This also seems likely with Relic Entertainment's experience of World War II with its Company of Heroes series. However, I struggle to see how this would work with Age of Empires gameplay. After Dawn of War 3, Relic Entertainment have made public statements about lessons being learnt, that they would integrate these lessons into their future projects. So we have pieces of evidence pointing towards them making gameplay changes to classic Age of Empires formula to bring it to a modern age, while also having evidence suggesting they might be less experimental after the flop that was Dawn of War 3. I'm very interested in seeing what happens with the Age of Empires franchise, and I'm sure many other game developers are. Age of Empires 4 seeming like the next and only big AAA RTS title coming out that I am aware of. There are many more indie RTS games in the works, though Northgard seems to be the only indie RTS that has developed a substantial audience, beating Tooth and Tail by quite a large margin on Steam. Though thanks to Tooth and Tail's design, it has crossplay, so pinning down the total number of players is much harder. It still had enough for me to not have to have too much trouble finding a game whenever I wanted to play, though it is still best to search for games during peak hours. One RTS coming out, which should be interesting for anyone who is a fan of Company of Heroes, is Iron Harvest. From the early footage, it looks like it has taken Company of Heroes and then made it dieselpunk, an alternative history of World War I, where there are dieselpunk mechs fighting alongside infantry. There is still a long time to go before the game is released, although from early footage, it looks very similar to Company of Heroes. I'm interested to see if they're bringing any major changes in gameplay, or they're taking the same gameplay mechanics and moving it to a different setting. I personally love Company of Heroes, so I'm interested in this game either way. When I mentioned earlier how developers will be looking at the success of Age of Empires 2 HD with interest, the next game seems to have come out of the whole Age of Empires 2 story. The game is called Empires Apart, and from early footage, it looks to be sticking thoroughly to the Age of Empires template. However, there are some major changes that make the game much more modern, despite sticking to the classic Age of Empires gameplay. I remember watching a live stream where the developers explained that they had to do something more modern, otherwise they'd get complaints that the game is just a rehash. However, I think they've taken a smart route to handle this. Empires Apart has many less factions than Age of Empires 2, Empires Apart having 6 factions, and at the time of writing this, Age of Empires 2 HD has 31. However, in Age of Empires HD, the differences between the factions is quite small. A few percentage differences here, a unique unit, and some tech tree changes. In Empires Apart, the different factions have very different tech trees and units, and seem to have as much difference between each other as the races in StarCraft. Personally, I am very interested to see how well the mechanics of Age of Empires hold up when they take place in a game where the factions are very different from each other. I have a feeling that this change will end up giving the game a very different feel to Age of Empires 2 HD, despite sharing many similar mechanics. However, Age of Empires 2 HD is a very micro-heavy game. Because of this, I imagine Empires Apart will be the same, being a focused competitive multiplayer RTS. I'm quite interested in seeing how well it performs because of this. I honestly believe that the future of the RTS genre is in achieving a balance between making it easier for players to play, while also trying to maintain the classic mechanics that made RTS great. As I've mentioned before in this video, I feel that Tooth and Tail has been the best attempt I can think of at maintaining this balance, achieving a great balance of pressure, variety, and just pure fun, all wrapped up in a very reasonably priced package. A strong recommendation from me. If you've made it all the way to the end of the video, then thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it.